Last week we spoke to Dirk Schoenmaker about the new Sustainable Finance RPN at the CEPR. Well, also on the steering committee is Alex Edmans of the London Business School and CEPR. And his book, Grow the Pie, makes the argument that there doesn't have to be a trade-off between growing value for businesses and growing value for society. But how strong is the evidence for this, and what does it mean in practice? Alex, welcome.
Hi Tim, it's great to be here.
Now, Alex, your work focuses on the importance of purpose for firms. Well, this often gets a treatment that economists would regard as hand-wavy, I suppose is the way they would describe it. How rigorous is the evidence that we have?
I think we should start by talking about what it means for a company to be purposeful. So what is purpose? It is serving wider society, not just shareholders. So clearly profit is important, but the whole idea of purpose is that you view profit as a byproduct of creating value for wider society. Just like for a person, their purpose is not to make money and earn a salary, but they will hopefully become financially secure if they pursue their purpose, be this to be an entrepreneur or to be a doctor. So then what does the evidence look like? And the evidence does show that many dimensions of purpose do pay off. So one of my own studies, published 10 years ago, looks at companies that treat their employees well as human beings, not as factors of production. And I used 28 years of data to show that companies that do treat their employees well outperform their peers by a significant amount. And importantly, what the evidence suggests is that it's treating employees well that later leads to profit, rather than the converse. Once the company is profitable, then you can start treating your workers well. And that distinction between correlation and causation is really important. Why? Because we love to believe that purpose would pay off, and so often we latch onto correlation, interpreting it as causation even when you can't do so. However, when you get to some of the other dimensions of purpose, the evidence is much more nuanced. It's not always the case that purpose is always going to pay off. And in particular, in perhaps the most important purpose dimension of the day, which is carbon emissions, you actually get the opposite result. So companies which are emitting more carbon actually deliver higher in terms of long-term shareholder returns. Now that's a massively inconvenient truth. Well, I wish this was not the case, and maybe things will change. Maybe that has been the case in the past because there was not a fair carbon price, and once there is, you're going to get the opposite result. But in this context, just at least in the past, there has been this trade-off. So any person who wants to think about the idea of purpose does need to recognise that in some cases there are trade-offs.
Also, the title of your book, Grow the Pie, is a distinction between what you call pie growing and pie splitting activities between business and society. What does this mean? Can you give me some examples?
Absolutely. So what is the pie to begin with? The pie is the amount of value that a company creates for society. And you often think that that pie can be split between investors in the form of profits and society in the form of value, that being wages to workers or taxes to the government and the like. And often you think as a leader, to maximize profits, I need to split the pie differently. I need to grab some pie from workers to boost my profits. And indeed, there are some companies which try to pay their workers as little as possible, let's say Sports Direct having that strategy. But why my book is called Grow the Pie is that if you create value to society, this is not giving up profits, this is actually expanding the pie, and therefore profits can grow also. So why might that be? Well, if you're treating your workers well, they're going to be more productive, more motivated, more likely to stay. If you are going to treat your customers fairly, rather than just trying to exploit them, then they're going to show loyalty, particularly in a pandemic. And then as per the answer to the first question, this idea that both society and shareholders can win simultaneously is not a too good to be true pipe dream. It does exist for many dimensions of purpose, but not all, as per the caveat in my first response.
Now, imagine, Alex, that I'm a CEO. Suspend your disbelief for a second, and I'm running a company. When it comes to purpose, what should I be telling my employees that their purpose should be?
Well, I'm going to give the controversial answer, you shouldn't. So I think as a CEO, it is your prerogative to say what your company's purpose should be, but not to say what the staff's purpose should be, because that's a personal thing, right? Going back to my earlier example, some people would like to be entrepreneurs, others doctors, and so on, and that's a personal decision. But I do think it's absolutely fair for you to say what your company's purpose is, and as long as you're clear about that, for some employees, they might really buy into that and get excited, and others might leave. And that's fine, that's their decision. So Zappos, the shoe company, what they used to do was to have a month-long employee training program where they would explain what the company's purpose and mission is, and at the end they would offer you, I think it was $5,000 to leave if that didn't actually resonate with your own personal purpose. I think that's really important, right? Because for purpose to actually be a real thing, rather than a nice mission statement, it shouldn't just sit in the C-suite, it should resonate at all levels throughout the company. And as long as you're clear about that, then if employees don't actually share that purpose, then it might be that they end up leaving. And that's fine, because different companies have different purposes. And just as some examples, so going back to climate, which is a really important challenge, right, there are some people who believe that climate is the only important challenge that companies should deal with. And there's other companies who believe, yeah, climate is really important, but there's also some social aspect. For example, if we are to decarbonise too quickly by shutting down polluting plants, we're going to make a lot of people redundant. And so there are other companies who will say, yes, we do care about decarbonisation, but we do think there's a balance, we need a just transition. And so there might be some companies who think, no, climate is the only important issue, it's always the first thing. And there's others who might be a bit more balanced. And as long as you make those expectations clear, then employees know what they're signing up for. And so to answer the question, it's the CEO's prerogative to set her company's purpose, but not to tell employees what they should be doing. And if employees don't agree, then they should be feel free to be able to go to a different company.
Okay, well, also on my problem list as a CEO, my large shareholders, institutional shareholders, they're pressurizing me to invest in all aspects of ESG policy and to really commit more to ESG, because they've been reading some articles and they've heard that that's going to grow the share price. Are they right? Should I be doing that?
Unfortunately, they're not. So this goes back to the whole idea of rigorous research, which is what the RPN is about, right? So there's loads of studies out there which look at the link between purpose and profit. And if you'd like to get a study published, and if you'd like to get it latched onto by the media and become famous, you have the incentive to torture the data to claim that purpose is going to be paying off. And you might think I'm a bit extreme by saying torturing the data, but there's a famous McKinsey study which looks at the link between diversity and firm performance, specifically ethnic diversity. And that's clearly something that I'm a strong believer in. I'd love to believe ethnic diversity pays off. And they claimed it did, and then that study was replicated, and then if you look at any other different permutation of the data, then that result goes away. And I think this is really important, because what it means is that, yes, we would like to look at this relationship, but the importance of academic research is we need to make sure, is this evidence really, really robust? Or is this something that a company is just releasing because it's good public relations? And so when you look at the most rigorous evidence, you do find that some dimensions of ESG pay off, but some don't, and in particular the ones that are immaterial don't actually pay off. So what do I mean by immaterial? There's certain stakeholders that really matter for your business model. So going back to climate, that is obviously really important in many industries, such as, say, energy or mining and so on. But for other industries, let's say tech, your environmental footprint is not so high. Maybe what matters much more is data security, privacy, cyberbullying, and cyber addiction, and so on. And where does materiality come in? Well, it would be easy to get a lot of good PR as a tech company to say, oh, we're best in class in terms of our carbon footprint. Everybody that resonates with you. Maybe it's not so popular to say, well, we're going to be really careful about our approach to data because that is not as popular as, say, climate. But actually, that is the dimension which is most important for your business and is most linked to your long-term shareholder returns. So your shareholders are wrong if they're claiming that. I'd say look at the evidence. It's the most material dimensions that do matter for long-term stock price performance. Just trying to do any kind of ESG that doesn't pay off, even though it would be attractive if that were the case.
Okay, so also item 3 on my to-do list this morning. I need to reach net zero by 2050 because that's government policy. As a CEO, should I be leading on this and moving ahead of the curve, or should I just respond to regulation? Because the problem is, if I'm a polluting firm, then that's going to mean I might be reducing my profits. I might have to make people redundant. What's my job here?
Yeah, I think your job is to recognise what are the most material stakeholders for you. And if you are in an industry where carbon is a really important stakeholder, then you should probably be leading this. And so a lot of my work is on the business case for responsibility, that it should not just be a compliance exercise. Let's just do the minimum possible to get away with complying with the law. It's in your interest to lead on these issues because they will be affecting your long-term performance. So if you are indeed in energy, then you know that most likely that there will be strong regulation against this in the future. So if you are on the front foot and developing these renewable sources, that's going to be really important. And it's not just those industries. It might be other industries where you're using energy as an important input, and it's something that customers might look at. So what are the sources of energy that you're using to engage in production? That's something you should be leading in. But if I go back to some other industries where maybe there's other more important issues, let's say tech, we've discussed the importance of data, maybe you're a clothing company and it's labour relations and the supply chain which are the most important issues, then maybe you should be focusing on those issues instead. So again, it depends on the business model and the context. This one-size-fits-all idea, which is climate change is the world's greatest threat, therefore every company should be doing its best to address that, I slightly disagree with. While I do agree that climate change is the world's greatest threat, that doesn't necessarily mean that for every single company in the world, that is the most important thing. There might be other important stakeholder issues, such as treating your workers fairly, that you should put front and centre for everything that you do.
Okay, so then in my final problem that I'm going to give you as a CEO, I'm getting criticised every week because a lot of people say that I'm being paid an unsustainably high amount in my job. I certainly get a lot more than the person who did the job 20 or 30 years ago. Are they right? Am I being paid too much as a CEO these days?
I'd say I couldn't answer that question unless I looked at your long-term performance, because you mentioned the word unsustainable, and I'm glad you put it in that way, because what is sustainable? That's not necessarily pay which is at the same level as other employees, but that's pay that is merited by your performance. So if you've created long-term, where the emphasis is long-term value for both shareholders and society, then you do deserve to be rewarded and paid fairly a result. Whereas if you haven't, then your pay should be low, or maybe you shouldn't even be in the job. So then when we think about how to reform pay, for me, the most important thing is not the level. Are you paid 100 times your employees or 80 times your employees? But the structure, so is your pay linked to the stock price in 5 or 7 years' time? Or is it instead linked to a quarterly earnings target? And if it's the former, then the only way that you can be handsomely paid is if you've created long-term value, if you've grown the pie. And this is why we again want to have the pie metaphor. Often we think that a CEO is well paid. That's at the expense of everybody else. But that's only true if you have a fixed pie. If the pie can be grown, then the only way that you can be paid more is if you created value for both shareholders and wider society.
What comes through very clearly in your work, and what you're saying to me today, is that very often the data that we use is not quite as strong as the conclusions that people infer from it. What don't we know on these topics that the RPN can start to address, do you think?
I'd actually say we know quite a lot about these topics, or let me rephrase, we have the potential to know quite a lot of these topics, because there is a lot of research out there on lots of these different dimensions of responsibility and ESG and so on. And this is very cross-disciplinary. It's people from accounting and finance and economics and organisational behaviour and strategy. But often this data and this really rigorous research gets lost in the noise. So if you have a study which has more nuanced conclusions, like ESG pays off but only if it's focused on the material issues, that's not going to be as popular as ESG always pays off, or study after study shows that responsibility pays off. And so one of the things which really attracted to me about the RPN is, yeah, part of it will be producing new research, but part of it will be taking the findings of existing research and making this much more applicable and much clearer, and also highlighting how you get different conclusions from some of these practitioner studies when you take seriously these issues such as correlation and causation and omitted variables and so on. The fact that the RPN involves both leading academics and leading practitioners makes sure that hopefully the output will be something which is not only academically rigorous, but also relevant for practitioners. And so this is why we think, for me, it is not only about producing new research, but making sure that the findings of existing research get out there, even if those findings are somewhat inconvenient truths, right? That is what the data shows, and any business leader who wants to pursue purpose should be aware of the tricky trade-offs, rather than thinking that purpose is always going to be a win-win, which is not the case.
Okay, Alex, finally, imagine my big CEO office, and there's a picture of Milton Friedman on the wall. He's been there for 50 years or so, and underneath his picture it says, "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits." The Friedman doctrine. Is it time to take that picture down now?
Well, I think the first thing you should do is to actually read the Friedman article. And that might seem a bizarre answer, because you might think, well, if you've written an article called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Profits," you don't need to read further, right? That title itself is so offensive, you know that what he's going to say, it's all about making money. But actually, right, if you read the article, it's much more nuanced than what you might think. So why he said you should only focus on profits is, at least if these are long-term profits, the only way that you can be profitable in the long term is if you serve society. Right? You need to treat your employees well, or they'll leave. You can't pollute the environment, or your brand will be hurt. So I wrote an article called "What Stakeholder Capitalism Can Learn from Milton Friedman." You can easily Google it, which shows that actually this idea is much more nuanced, and we can actually learn quite a lot from reading this article. Now, despite me standing in his camp when I wrote that article, I still concluded that I don't agree with the article. And there's many reasons why we should pursue purpose, even if you take a nuanced approach to his article. But I do think it was an important starting point, because if we want to have a responsible approach to capitalism, we need to explain why just thinking about long-term profit, i.e. this emphasis being on long-term, is not enough. And I would say that purpose is more than just a long-term approach to profit, but I would still say keep his picture up there, because there is a lot in what he says, and if we want to take a different view of how to run businesses, we need to understand what the prevailing view is and take it seriously rather than caricature it. So while the world has moved on, I think he made a lot of important conclusions, just like some great scientists found some stuff where we've moved on since then, but that's not to deny the contribution that those scientists made.
Alex, it's a good lesson that if you look carefully at the data, if you look carefully at the work that other people have done, then we can reach some surprising conclusions, can't we? So good luck with the RPN. Thank you for talking to me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for inviting me, Tim.
You can keep up with what's going on in the Sustainable Finance RPN using this link. And Alex's book is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, and it's available from Cambridge University Press.